Welcome to Regents Roundtable. I'm Stephen Ludwig. My guest today is Jerry Israel. Dr. Israel's work centers on sharing his expertise in presidential strategy, board relations, and accreditation. He is focused on effective board communications, institutional strategic planning, fundraising, and alumni affairs, as well as crisis communications. For the past 8 years, he's been a senior consultant with Academic Search, an executive search firm for higher education, facilitating about 40 searches, 40 of them for presidents, vice presidents, and deans. He frequently helps new presidents map out their first and most crucial 100 days, 6 months, and first year in office, assisting them in developing an evaluation tool to ensure board relations are positive and effective. Dr. Israel is also a prolific writer and speaker on higher education issues, who has served on a host of education boards and commissions, focusing on developing innovative and progressive approaches in higher education leadership. His recent book, The 75 Biggest Myths About College Admissions, was published by Sourcebooks. Dr. Israel, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, great to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, yeah, it's great to see you. So, as a regent, you might recall you did some work with us. I was a bit of an outlier. A lot of people describe the job of a trustee or regent as, they're supposed to protect and serve the institution. But I've always thought that was only half the job. I think the half we don't talk about is ensuring that the institution fulfills its mission. I served on the board of the University of Colorado system, so I always felt my job was to ensure the public university did its best to serve, the public interest. Of course, there's always going to be different ways. This is a very long preamble to a question, sorry. Of course, there's a lot of different ways to think about that. On more than one occasion, I had rather strong opinions that were not in alignment with the administration or my fellow board members. Sometimes I was good and successful in sharing those views in a way that was helpful. Other times, really not so much. On more than one occasion in my 12 years as a regent, I was considered a pain in the ass, to be quite frank, which isn't really fun. No one wants to be seen as a jerk. In your years of working with boards, what advice would you have for trustees or regents so they can ensure the college or university is serving its intended mission in a way that is productive, productive being the key word here?
I would say ask lovingly ask tough questions. The board members, wherever they come from, are successful, or they wouldn't have been invited or elected to have that opportunity. And sometimes I think they're intimidated because those of us in higher education use a lot of jargon, other things to try to put people off. And it's important to remember that trustees and regents may not know a lot about your enterprise, but they know a lot about a lot of stuff, and they have good minds and great experience. So really asking, again, I say lovingly, you don't want to go, you're right, you don't want to be a pain in the ass because, that creates a dynamic which may not be productive. So as long as you folks understand that you are passionate about the place and you want it to be successful, I think it's totally legitimate, indeed necessary, to ask tough questions. The best trustee I ever had said to me, your job is to ask questions I don't want to hear. Your job is to make me uncomfortable talking to me as an administrator. And the best question I ever got was when a new trustee had come through a meeting where they were discussing a 30-year bond issue for a new building. And he pulled me aside at the party before dinner and asked me in my ear, are we even going to be using that building 30 years from now?
Oh.
And I said, I have no idea, but that's exactly, as a new trustee, the question you ought to be asking.
So that person had some background, obviously, in business or whatever, to ask a really smart question. What some context do you think that would be helpful for new regents or trustees or what have you to gain as they get on a board? Because most trustees or regents, don't have a background in higher education.
Right. Well, we don't do a very good job at orientation. I think in our culture, in our society, we don't do a very good job at orientation generally. And, you don't want to do too much because it's kind of brain deadening.
Yeah.
But it is important to spend some time sort of learning the vocabulary. I had a great trustee once. I was a dean, and I was using a lot of words that, jargon that we use in our industry. And he was a banker and a smart one. And he stopped me in my tracks very quickly and said, Jerry, respectfully, every time you use a word, I'm not sure what it means. I'm going to ask you to define it. So I think it is important. Maybe it would be helpful to establish maybe a cheat sheet of, let me use an example, retention. Retention in our business is good because it means students progress towards graduation. They don't drop out or flunk out. Retention in my wife's world, K-12 world, means you leave a student back, that they don't go to the third grade from the second grade.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a bad thing. And if it's not too graphic, retention for a urologist is a really bad thing because your kidneys are not organized. So,
Yeah.
how would a person know what retention means when I use it if we don't define it? So I think a solid orientation session with some cheat sheets about just the words we use, and people are bright enough. If they know what you mean, they'll be able to ask good questions.
Yeah. I think that would have been very helpful for me, I'm sure, and others. One of the things that I talked about in the introduction a little bit, was that idea of mission. And, for the one I'm most familiar with, of course, is the University of Colorado, where I served. The campus was founded when the state was founded in 1876. The major technologies of the day were the steam engine and the telegraph.
Right.
And so people go, well, this is what the institution's for, implying some sort of me- framework, when I know we've evolved over time and people have made decisions. How do you think regardless if it's a public university or a private nonprofit or what have you, how do you think a trustee or regent could get really acquainted with the institution's particular mission? Should they go look at something? Should they ask about it? Because people get locked in about culture sometimes defines things rather than mission.
Right. Um, I think, again, this is perhaps part of an extended orientation, at least annually, when most boards have a retreat or a time when they get a little bit away from the business agenda to talk about larger issues, which I think is good. And it's important sometimes, and I'm not trying to polish my own saddle, but it's important sometimes to bring people in who ask good questions or help you see things. If I can I'd like to talk about examples. Um, I was in one such event, and the strategic planning person who came in was a poet. I thought, not an engineer, not a marketing vice president, but a poet. He happened to know something about strategic planning. And as I was president, he asked me, Jerry, what's your mission? And I fumbled through the obvious stuff about helping students, and so on and so forth. And as a poet, he said, and it's never left my mind. He said, I think maybe your mission is to help students find their stories to tell.
Oh,
Um, it's about your mission is about the future. You have all these intellectual resources. A place like the University of Colorado has uncountable intellectual resources at its command. And I think the mission is to take those extraordinary resources, which the taxpayers of Colorado are spending a lot of money to support, as they should, if they're used properly, and to use those resources in the most effective way in the short term to allow students to take the next step in their lives, to certify them, to credential them, to educate them, but also more globally to think about the future of the state of Colorado and of the United States and of the world. If we could line up the resources with the outcomes, then I think we'd have the mission pretty focused.
yeah. And that sort of process could be used for any institution, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Why do we have these resources?
Mhm.
If I can be pandering for a moment, I just read something you put out, I think, on LinkedIn about publisher perish.
Mhm.
And you're absolutely right that most of this, let me say much, I don't want to be that critical, much of the scholarship that folks do, and it's well intended,
Yes.
isn't relevant to solving anybody's problems. And if we could take at least I'm not denying the value of pure research. You never know how it's going to be useful.
Right.
But you take a piece of that, a portion of that, a half of that, and actually focus it on the issues that do matter, both today, tomorrow, and 10 years from now, it would be an extraordinary accomplishment.
So that would be calling into question, which is hard for board members. I think it's a perfectly legitimate question myself. So the stat I'd found was in 2018, there are 3 million academic articles published in peer-reviewed English language academic journals.
Right.
And it's just from that volume, there's no way all that's helpful.
no.
But
Well,
that's an anathema. As even asking that question is an anathema that freaks people out. Like, don't you believe in research? It's like, well,
yeah,
yes, but not all of this is necessarily helpful.
yeah. And how many of those have even been read?
Right. Absolutely. So going back a second, do you have any? I was talking about my sometimes I had good communication, sometimes I had poor. Do you have any counsel on how a trustee can approach their fellow board members and administration when they are concerned about this idea that we're talking about mission creep for an institution,
Yeah.
and maybe they're getting away from um, serving the student populations they should? Let me add some context to that.
Yeah.
There's this desire to be the best at, or the Harvard of, or the ranked in this. And I see that from my study and research and what I've read, is that can really be unhelpful for undergraduates.
Yeah.
And so what's a constructive way for a trustee or board member to ask those? That's a really hard question to ask, but what's a constructive way to get at that?
I think the key is to go back to something that started in K-12, and higher ed has adopted some of it. We spend way too much time on the input. If you get a faculty member,
Yeah.
they'll tell you, I cover this, and then I talk about this. And it was my wife, a K-12 administrator and teacher, who asked me one day, what is it that the students learn? People say I taught this and I taught that, but she correctly pointed out to me that you haven't taught anything until somebody's learned it.
Mm-hmm.
You may have said it, but how do you know? So I would say that a legitimate, probably painful question that trustees can ask is, what do we know about the outcomes? Does anybody assess the quality of the learning that's going on? Faculty really resent the notions of,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
um, and it can be overdone. It can become formulaic and just checking a box and putting it up on the shelf and satisfying some outside accreditor. And that's not terribly beneficial. But really serious, high quality assessment. What is it that students learn? Um, uh, if you if you cover the material, you ought to be able to know whether or not the students have processed it. I'm a historian. We teach American history in the second grade, the fifth grade, the eighth grade, the 11th grade, sophomore year of college. Why do we have to keep doing it over? So, Adams still came after Washington. I mean, we don't recreate the history. Obviously, we get more sophisticated as the students' learning capacity grows. But in reality, we're not doing a very good job because they're not retaining an awful lot of what they've learned.
Yeah, that's it. And I know that's faculty really don't like that conversation.
No.
Yeah.
Well, it challenges whether but they're good dentists and bad dentists, and they're
Yep.
good second baseman and bad second baseman, and they're good faculty and bad faculty.
So
So
there are no bad faculty, because if you ask an administration of any institution, they don't have any bad faculty. So
well,
clearly that they're right.
and, and, and and they're no bad doctors, but it
Right.
is interesting that the nurses know which pediatricians to take their kids to.
Absolutely. And if you ask faculty who are the faculty that aren't any good on campus, they'll be happy to tell you because they know.
Yeah,
But
they do.
the presidents and the deans, they'll never tell
Yeah.
publicly, right?
And nobody will raise their hand and
No.
testify to it. But um, the high quality faculty are not scared about being investigated or evaluated because they know that they can do a better job, but also that they're doing the best they can under the current circumstances.
Yeah.
So uh, I'm not a big fan of protecting the whole flock when not everybody's carrying their weight.
Yeah. And again, I do love, and sometimes this doesn't come through, but I love faculty. Like, I love what they do, and I love what they bring to the classroom, and I love the research. And then, but with you, it's like some of them aren't particularly great.
And
And
they may be not just because they're not performing at their best. I mean, we're in a learning business, aren't we? I
yeah.
mean, not some of them can be made better. They just have
Mhm.
to be able to accept. We're a very protected species, and we don't have a lot of courage to face. We can criticize students, but we don't like to be criticized
Yeah.
ourselves. Probably human nature, but we got to get better than that.
Yeah. All right. Switching gears here.
Yeah.
One of the most important jobs, a trustee or regent or governor or visitor, or I don't know how many names they have for this job, but I'm trying to hit all of them, is to hire and then oversee a college or university president or
Yes.
chancellor, whatever the name is. You've been doing a lot of that work in this area. You've been
Yes.
really engaged, and I'm hoping you can provide some insight. What do you think are, and I'm sure you could write an entire book about this. So, what are some common mistakes board makes when, in the initial part, when they start looking for a new executive?
I would say the biggest mistake is being afraid to. You may give lip service to wanting change, but people default to the status quo pretty quickly. And, you know, I don't necessarily think we need to go to the other end of the spectrum and go out and find the biggest rabble rouser we can find. But I do think it's important to, the one thing you don't want to say to a new president is that's the way we've always done it. And because this is a rare occasion, I mean, even though the turnover in presidents is pretty quick now, every 5 to 7 years, sometimes less, it's still important to use that opportunity to look at first principles of what you're about. You talk about mission. It's an opportunity to match the mission to the current status, to the board, to the president. So I think you want to be open to change. Now we have a lot of, happily now, finally, we have a lot of demographic change. We finally, I think, have really blown open the glass ceiling on racial and gender and other kinds of, and that's great. It's been way too long in coming. But we also need thought patterns. I mean, people don't have, I think presidents coming in want to say, oh, you've done a great job. You don't want to come in and say you've done everything terribly, but you do need people that are willing to ask. I go back to the same point. I guess it's my mantra, tough questions.
Mhm.
Why? Why have we thought about other ways to do it? And so I think boards need to be open to having the courage that somebody might come in and ask them a tough question about why they've been doing things a certain way and not play it. We play it too safe. I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah.
We try to find the son of or the daughter of the last president. That may be great, but let's look for some outliers.
Yeah. What there's a tendency for presidents when they come in to sort of say, okay, my predecessor did this. We're not touching that ever again. We're doing my thing. And if you said the time frame, did you say 5 to 7 years is the average?
It was 7. It's probably down to 5 now.
Yeah, that's not a lot of time to get stuff done.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's that. So what I like the idea of like, okay, let's freshen the air here. Let's get some new thinking, of course.
Right.
And then that challenge of we need some consistency to move forward. I mean, that's a tough balancing act.
Exactly. I think it's also an information issue. I think one of the issues about boards and presidents, this may not be a direct answer to your question, but I think it's relevant, is sometimes boards give presidents so much detail about the way the place has been operating, they get buried in it. President is a chief executive, needs to have an understanding of operations, but you don't want your president spending every day doing somebody else's job. The president ought to have people reporting to her or him who can. I used to say I need to know 3 minutes about every subject that might come up, but then I also need to know who to turn to for the 4th minute. So you have to be a generalist. You have to be prepared to go in sort of lots of different directions. So if you mire somebody down in the details, they're not going to get there. The other problem is some people get so global and so up in the vision, so 40,000 foot level that they really can't feel the texture and the context of the institution. So it's a balancing act. You need to be able to understand enough about the operation to be able to have the vision and not get lost on either side. Mm-hmm. And that's not an easy job. And then you have, of course, a president, especially of a place like the University of Colorado or any other flagship state university, has got to be responsive to so many outside constituencies. And trying to figure out how to manage all of that is difficult. I'm a big fan of boards, going back to an earlier question, having sort of specialists. I mean, I had a board where the chair of the finance committee was the CFO of $1 billion corporation. It's kind of the old stock market commercial. When he talked, people listened. So if you have certain expertise on your board and you get them in the right positions of leadership, a board member serves for 3 or 6 or 9 or 12 or so how many years. over time they come up to speed, and then you take your chief financial officer of the college or university, you match them up with the chair of the finance committee coming in from a major organization, and you allow them some room to develop policy, and then the president comes in kind of to referee, to communicate, to make sure that one sector is not fighting with another sector, and kind of balance it all off. It requires an awful lot of, I guess the word I would use, I hadn't thought about it, is balance.
Yeah.
You can't let yourself be blown in one direction or another too quickly by one of those constituencies.
I'm just affirming what you're sharing. We had expertise in construction on the board, so when we had construction issues, we'd all look to that member. When we had
Right.
finance issues, we had a bank president.
Right.
We had education issues. We had a former K-12 teacher and principal on our board, and we'd look to them.
Right.
And so, yeah. One of the things you mentioned, the a poet that was also an expert in strategic planning.
Right.
And so in Colorado, which is a total outlier, there's 4 states that elect regents.
Right.
I went to 2 community colleges and graduated from the smallest campus of the University of Colorado system.
I remember.
And there'd be no way in a million years, because I'm not wealthy, I'm not an attorney, I don't have that kind of background. There's no way in a million years I would have ever been on a board. But I felt, because of my background, I brought a particular point of view
Absolutely.
that I hope was helpful.
Mhm.
How can boards look sort of like to a little bit less than the captains of industry, for a lack of a better phrase, to help ensure they have some interesting voices on the board that can help them see things in a new way?
That's a great question. I've actually seen boards that develop a grid. You lay out across the top what are the skills, attributes, talents, qualifications that we want to have as a composite. You're never going to get 100%, but the more you get, the better. Now, it's time, treasure, and talent. We know that in certain institutions, especially private, board members are looked to for resources, but it's also time. Do they have the time to put in? Do they have the talent, as we just said, in certain areas? And then you go down the side, every board has a membership, and then you get opportunities to bring on new members, whether you elect them or mostly appoint them.
Yeah.
And you look, who do we have? What are our gaps? And I think there needs to be a board affairs committee or a nominating committee that takes seriously when an opportunity presents itself for a new member to say, what is it, if you have all white men, that's a demographic reality, because not all your students are going to be white men. If you have all people who are, 70 and older, which can happen on appointed boards, you need to perhaps find the ones who can bring a bit more of a contemporary perspective to the table, and so on. And if you don't have somebody in construction or finance with that skill, then you probably need to find that. So I do think you have to be intentional. And then you also have to be lucky. It's the chemistry of the board members and how they interact, and that's the role of the chair. Another role that I played for a few years. I mean, the chair of the board's got to be as in any organization, has got to try to find as much consensus amongst the differences, because at the end of the day, you need to make decisions.
Yeah.
And if it's so fractured, as you well know, that can be extremely difficult.
It's not fun if it gets too fractured, and there's no reason for it, but sometimes it happens. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can correct. You can correct for it the next chance you get.
Yeah. We were talking about your experience, your extensive experience with presidential searches. What are some common mistakes that presidents make when taking a new position? And I liked how you, in your professional career right now, you're helping presidents do that 100-day plan, 6-month
Right.
plan, 1-year plan. How do you help them ensure they have the right tone and relationship with their trustees? Easy question, I'm sure.
Well, I'm trying to pull it all together because I've done it. I've been a president. I've been a board chair. I've been a vice president working for a president. Listening. I mean, it's a cliche, but I had a friend once who said, "You have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you ought to listen and look a lot more than you talk." I think you start by, and you can't take, as you say, with a 5-year term, you can't spend too much time collecting information. But I think it is important to listen to the key constituents. It's important to establish relationships with trustees and faculty and community leaders and political leaders and the rest. So I would say one of the mistakes as presidents, because we have new presidents have a lot of energy and a lot of talent and a lot of experience, they just didn't get picked out of the blue. They start talking before they've listened. And
And they
presidents
come.
presidents are expected to talk a lot and to communicate. They are the voice person for the institution. So there's a tendency to talk a lot. And you do want to listen. And it's amazing, going back to my 7 years as president of the University of Indianapolis, the things I heard. The most important thing I heard was like in the first week, and probably wasn't the first day, one of the senior leaders of the community, a wonderful man, now gone from us sadly, came in my office, and we were independent, but we bore the city's name. And he said, Jerry, you have one thing that everybody wants, and that's independence. People answer to shareholders, or they answer to elected officials, or you don't answer really to anybody except your own voluntary board. Use that independence. People want to partner with you because they want a piece of that independence if they can get it. So I don't know what it is you're going to hear, but pay attention to what you hear. A lot of it is just not terribly useful, probably, but I would say listen before you speak as much as possible. And then the other thing goes back to my mantra of toughness and courage. Don't be afraid that somebody, new president, you don't want to get your key donor or board chair mad at you.
Right.
But don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to have some courage. I go back to that board chair who said to me, Jerry, just don't tell me what I want to hear. Tell me what I don't want to hear.
Yeah.
And
It's interesting.
thank God for him, because he enabled me to ask the tough questions.
What's interesting is how basic, and I'm never offended when someone reminds me to do the basic stuff, because sometimes we just forget. The comment about, listen clearly, ask hard questions, listen, ask hard questions. I mean, it's a theme that it makes sense. And sometimes, is it Richard DeMillo wrote in one of his books about the challenge with college presidents is that they were always the smartest person in the room.
We like to think we are.
Right. And so, we've seen some college presidents that just have really big egos that sometimes get in their way.
Absolutely.
And I don't, if you have a big personality, big ego, great. If you can still listen, terrific. But
listen across the board. Derek Bach, when he was at Harvard,
mm-hmm.
his office was in the basement of a residence hall. Just the symbol of that alone was significant. I'm sure he was insulated. But the reality of it is, if you're in the basement of a residence hall, you're more likely to run into a student than if you were stuck in some ivory tower where students were afraid to go. I'm not trying to pat my own back, and I'm certainly not Derek Bach, but I felt one time that I was sort of I prided myself on my connection with students, but coming out of the classroom, but I felt like I had sort of lost the mojo for a while. It's possible. And what can I do about it? So I just took myself to the coffee shop in the student union, and I had an office hour there. Now, students were still intimidated to walk up.
Of course.
They still know you're the president.
Yeah.
But again, it imaged well, and I didn't do it just for that reason, but at least sent the message that maybe I was accessible. But I had some serious conversations with students. The other advantage of that is, once you establish a relationship with anyone, they're more willing to come to you than they would be for the first time. And the most important thing is the student telling all the other students, hey, you can talk to him. Mm-hmm. I like to be called Jerry. Hey, you can talk to Jerry. He's not. Don't be afraid. So, and we all believe what we hear from somebody who's not supposed to be a source. If my VP for student affairs went up and told, you can go talk to Jerry, well, why should I believe you?
Right.
But if another student came up to me and said, you can go talk to him. So I think that's important. You need to be listening to, you read all these stories about presidents of the United States who never talk to anybody who doesn't make $500,000 a year. And then you're supposed to help to shape an economy for people that are struggling. You need to hear some truth from people that aren't just trying to pat you on the back. Mm. And it isn't always pleasant. But again, I come back to that. You got to be open to those tough questions are lovingly asked. I want you to get better. You need to know this. Are we going to use this building 30 years from now? He was an engineer, by the way, and he knew what was coming. What was coming was more digital learning, and will we still be in bricks and mortar 30 years from now? And are we going to be paying for the bricks and mortar that we stopped using 10 years ago? I mean, those are tough questions, and yet they need to be asked.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that you've said again, and I didn't emphasize this before, the lovingly part, because we all can ask questions in a way that is loving and supporting, or accusatory and nasty,
Right.
or somewhere in between, right? And that affirmation, even though it's a hard question, comes across. I also like what you shared from your personal example and Derek Bach's example is when I'm a region or trustee, I can look and see what kind of relationship the person has had in their previous position with students and faculty and what have you.
Right.
And yeah, and the bigger the institution, the more there's so many constituents to worry about. But I think that's an interesting thing that I could tick off and say, oh, as we look for an executive, how do they remain connected to the people?
Right. Our son got a doctorate at Stanford, and I went out to visit, and I was walking around with him on that magnificent campus. And I said, and I was president at the time of another place, and a much, much, much smaller place. And I said, it's fun to be on a campus where not everybody knows. And he sort of sarcastically said, "That's okay, Dad. The students here don't know what the president of Stanford looks like either." Which is a way of saying, that person is never visible, and it's so sad. I'll have provosts of medium-sized places tell me, well, if I went to the cafeteria, nobody would know who I was. And I thought, that is so sad. You're moving these students and faculty around on a chessboard, but you don't know them as people. The other thing that's sad about it is sitting down for lunch with students in a cafeteria is the most fun part of the day, and you learn a lot. And people would deny themselves that pleasure. I mean, there's so much crap that goes on in your job. Let's face it. Why would you deny yourself the best thing on campus, which is talking to your students, talking to your young faculty as their careers are emerging? I mean, that's what it's all about. And your job is to help them get better. I mean, so why would you not want to interact with them? I never understood that.
So when it comes to trustees, we really, the way people like to have it work, and it makes sense to me, is you get the information from the administration, you take it as gospel, you act on that. At a public institution, it gets complicated. My experience is such an outlier, it doesn't really count. But people really get angry when trustees talk to faculty or students themselves and bring that information back. And it's like, well, you said one thing, but I'm hearing from faculty this other thing. It feels like they're undermining the administration. But sometimes we don't get the information we think we need. How do you balance that so you don't create this really horrible work environment for the board and the administration, but still get information or stay connected yourself as a trustee?
My knee jerk to that, and I'll do better than this, but my initial knee jerk to that is that I think and this is something I thought about when I knew we were going to speak, people in our industry for some reason are terribly scared. I mean, we are the safest, most independent group. I mean, compare the degree of autonomy we have in our jobs, even in a regulated institution, with other sectors that are so managed. I mean, so maybe it's that maybe it's that we're not used to being criticized. But so I think that's part of it. We have to, if we can do it, I'm not a social psychologist, we have to find a way to get the people we work with to relax a little bit and not be so darn scared. They're afraid to have skin in the game. I mean, but you can't function in the real world. I hate that phrase, but it's reality. If you don't have some skin in the game, and you discover that it's fun. I mean, if you take risks, the rewards are much greater. But I would say my statement to my vice presidents, let's put it that way, was talk to whoever you want to talk to and respond to whoever wants to talk to you. I would like to know, if possible, if you're talking to a trustee and a vice president's talking to a trustee, please have that conversation. And maybe you want to share what you heard with me, and maybe you don't. But I would at least like to know you had the conversation. So when I walk into a meeting with that trustee, I'm not blindsided by saying, "I was talking to George," and
Mhm.
that kind of thing. But my view of that is, if you tell people they can't talk to each other,
Mhm.
they'll find a tree at midnight to talk about with
Yeah.
each other. You can't stop people from doing that. Why would you try to stop people from doing what they're going to do anyway?
Yeah.
You might as well at least. And besides, you can learn an awful lot about things by hearing what other people have to say. I mean, it's a very good filter because they're not always straight with you. When you're the president, when you're a trustee, folks aren't always being honest with
What?
you, believe it or not. And
Again, everyone wants to look good. I get that, right?
yeah,
No one wants to say, we blew this one.
yeah.
Yeah.
The best advice I ever got early in my first presidency was from a wonderful trustee who I didn't even know that well. Came in my office, asked if we could talk privately, and lovingly said to me, "Jerry, you're doing a great job at half your job." And I said, "What is it?" We had some issues, and he said, "What's that mean? What does that mean?" He said, "You're in those meetings. You're managing problems. You're solving. You're moving forward." He said, "But the role of a president is also to be external, to be a cheerleader, to be out and about, to be pressing the flesh. And you're locking yourself in your office too much." I mean, it was my nature to be extroverted, but I was denying it to myself because I had so many problems I felt I needed to solve. He said, "Get out there. You'll be better. They'll see it. And when you go out there, don't carry with you on your face the fact that that problem isn't solved. Smile." And because people look at you and they want to know what the temperature of the place is, and they're taking your temperature all the time. And if you walk out there like you got the weight of the world on your shoulders, they start worrying about their jobs, they start worrying about their educations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was great advice. And if he hadn't had the courage to walk in my office and tell me that, he didn't do it painfully. He did it constructively, and it was the best advice I ever got.
So there's the another theme about transparency. So like if a trustee talks to a vice president or a
Mhm.
trustee talks to a faculty member or student, just raise the flag. I talked to this student. I talked to this faculty member. So you're not caught off guard, and it doesn't feel like to you I'm going around you to you the president. It doesn't feel like I'm going around you to get
Right,
dirt. Right? It's just, no, I'm talking to people.
right. And you can also use that line of communication for your own purposes. If you know that you've got someone who's got a great relationship with a trustee or a legislator or whoever it might be, you don't always have to be carrying the mission. You talked about that. The president's the smartest person in the room. You don't always have to be the one talking. If you know your people. I had a great vice president once who was able to. He was a social psychologist. Everybody should have one. He could take the temperature in a room down real quick. So I sent him out. I don't need to be out there. I'm not particularly skilled at that. Sent him out there, and people relaxed, and it made it easier for me to go in behind him and have people actually listen to me.
Nice.
So it's human resources, it's people management, it's all those things. No, you talk about hiring a president. Nobody knows enough to cover all those bases.
No.
You got to surround yourself with the best people who complement what you do,
Mhm.
and then you also again come back to, you got to listen. And the second time around, the third time around, um, it gets easier because you start understanding. Um, I felt that my only advantage as a president was that I sort of knew what was going to happen a half a second before it did, and that gives you a huge advantage
Mhm.
because you know when the conversation is going to be productive and when it's not.
This just reminds me. This conversation reminds me how I never thought it was easy, but how complicated the job of a chancellor or president actually is, and
Right.
how many different irons are in the fire at all the time. And it just amplifies the bigger the institution, the more the headaches come and more different things. And so I think as a trustee, just acknowledging like it's a really hard job. And I'm sure it's very rewarding, but it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, but those trustees are, as you said, you have a bank president, you've got
Hmm.
a whatever. Their jobs are hard too.
Hmm.
So it's identifying, being sympathetic. I'll tell you what the hardest thing is. The two hardest things, from my experience, 13 years as a president, is no two things are ever connected. You're talking about something having to do with the physical plant, with the chair of the buildings and grounds committee for 15, 30 minutes. And suddenly the next thing is a student coming in talking about, can they have a special major in biochemistry? It's not connected. You got to be able to go from one to the other to the other to the other, and there's nothing holding them all together. The other part of that, and I guess it's related, it's the other piece of this, is that the day ends and you have a nice meal and you talk to your spouse and you maybe have a glass of wine, you read the paper, you go to bed. 3 o'clock in the morning, you wake up, and the thing during the day that you hadn't even thought much about, that was the most troubling or significant, suddenly is right there in the front of your head. It's like your mind is spinning all that stuff while you're sleeping. I'm sure it is. And it pops right to the top. And I better think about that again. And you didn't have time to think about it. And again, you have to surround yourself with quality staff, chief of staff, administrative assistant, who know your style, who know how to sort your day and know how to lean you, and don't try to do your job for you, but set you up. I mean, that stuff is so valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And you notice when a congresswoman walks out, and you see on TV, when a congresswoman walks out of a meeting with the world weight on her shoulders, there are always these two relatively young folks carrying a lot of binders. Well, that's her staff, and
Mm-hmm.
they know where she's going next and what the next problem is going to be, and they've got 90 seconds on the Senate subway to get her ready for that next meeting. I mean, you got to have that kind of glue, and you got to trust those people.
We have time for one more question. We could talk for another few hours, but I want to ask, there's a controversy at public institutions in particular when it comes to sole finalists
Yeah,
for
yeah,
the chief
yeah.
executive.
I've been reading about that.
Yeah, and when we had search firms talk to us, we had consultants talk to us as a regent, and the consistent message was anyone worth their salt is not going to be put up for a beauty contest and not picked. And so the sole finalist is the only way. And so what they do is, just for in case people aren't familiar with this, is, you have your search committee, they bring to the board a group of candidates, the trustees and the regents or whomever interview that person, they pick who they like, and they bring it to the public. And people really, especially faculty, hate that.
Right.
What are your thoughts about all that?
It's tough. I mean, the axiom that some folks will not hang in there if they think there's anybody they're competing with is true. It's not universally true. There's no easy answer. Where it's a problem, and I'm not pointing my fingers at Colorado or Missouri or North Carolina or Iowa, some of the states that have had these issues. Everybody in the industry knows about them. It's going to come down to the quality of the sole finalist. I mean, it's true in anything. If you're negotiating with a great whatever, and that person emerges and they live up to all of their credentials, within 6 months or a year, people are going to forget about it. They're not going to remember whether the sole finalists there were three. If they're the best thing since sliced bread, it's going to be a win. But in those states where interference has been allowed to occur, and you get somebody who's not the best thing since sliced bread, then the sole finalist feels like it's kind of smelly. So I think the sole finalist thing is a means. The end is to find the best possible president you can find. And if the best possible president says, I'm only going to do that, I'd like to think that the best possible president would say, bring it on, I'll compete with somebody else. But the reality of it is that back at home, they're going to minimize their effectiveness if people think they're looking to leave. And there's no way around that. So if that's where the trustees, the regents have to make a tough call. Is this person really good enough to risk the backlash coming from the sole finalist opposition? And even the faculty, if you bring in a person that really, really connects to the faculty, and they realize that in 3 or 6 months, they'll get over their peak about the fact that they were kind of excluded from the process. So I don't have an easy answer. It's the most important thing boards do. You said it. And it's the toughest thing boards do. And as a consultant, we can help. We don't make decisions. We facilitate. We ask questions. We yell landmine if you want to walk into it. It's your call. You act. We advise you act. But you got to have good advice, and you got to really look down the barrel at each other and say, I want this guy bad or this woman badly enough that I'm willing to take that hit. We're not going to get rid of it, because there are the good president. A lot of presidents are going to not be in there. You're right. They're not going to stay in. So I don't have a magic solution. I think that you got to talk it through and pray and try to make the right call. And I don't think the sole finalist will poison a successful president's career. But I think the sole finalist, if it's the wrong finalist, will be something you'll never get over.
Yep. Yep. That just bears out from what the examples you shared and others, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's no magic. That's why I don't do those kinds of searches usually. But that's
Yep.
why search consultants can charge hefty fees
Yep.
because they're carrying a lot of responsibility to tell you we've done all the due diligence, we looked under every rock, we've talked to everybody we can talk to, we think this person's good enough.
Hmm.
And then it comes down to the collective wisdom of the group. You all have to look inside yourself and say, you're not going to get this chance again very soon. Is this the right person? And there's nothing magic, but we all have examples where the Derek Bachs of the world can make a difference in an institution.
Hmm.
You know, so if you make the right call, it's worth all the pain.
Well, Jerry, this has been a great conversation. And
love
like I said, we could have talked for a few more hours for sure. Maybe, we'll see how this podcast goes and maybe we'll bring you back.
Well, I would look forward to it. Thank you, and appreciate what you're doing to keep, to lovingly. What we do is wonderful, and we shouldn't let all the negatives chew at us. It's important work, and
Oh, I forgot. This is my closing question.
okay.
And I ask all my guests this. It's really important. So thank you for saying what you did because I forgot it. What do you like most about working in higher education?
Said it at the beginning, and I'll quote someone who many people feel was the best teacher they ever knew. Didn't know him, but I communicated with him. Saul Gittleman was the provost at Tufts and had the reputation for being one of the great, if not the great teacher of his generation. And he said that the reward is when you see the light go on in your students' eyes. There's nothing like it.
Well, that's a great note to end on.
Thank
Thanks again, Jerry.
My pleasure. Thank
All right.
you.
Take care.
Take care.